Good afternoon, everyone. Just barely afternoon. Welcome to the IBS speaker series. We have Johannes, who is going to be presenting to us today. And we just have a couple of brief announcements before we get started. I have the announcement, most of them up on the screen, but if you have any questions about anything, feel free to send me a chat using the Zoom chat and I can help you out with anything. We are going to be hearing from Johannes, and if you have any clarifying questions during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, and we can answer make sure that Johannes sees it and is able to answer any clarifying questions. Please hold any bigger questions for the end. We will have time for question and answer at the end, and we will still be monitoring the chat and using our raise hand functions for those. Aside from that, the last thing I want to say is read is a land statement acknowledging the traditional territories that CU sits on. So as we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. I'm going to pass this off to Stefan, who is going to do the introduction for Johannes.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and welcome everyone to today's talk. It's my great pleasure to introduce you who doesn't know him yet, Dr. Johannes Uhl. He will give a talk today as a current postdoctoral research associate who's working with us at IBS. Let me introduce quickly some facts about Johannes. He is a geographical information scientist and thus a real expert in methods, spatial, temporal, analytical methods, and an expert in spatial data integration methods. He earned a diploma in geodesy and surveying engineering in 2009 at the Karlsruhe University of Applied Sciences, a master degree, Master of Science in geomatics in 2011 at the Karlsruhe University of Applied Sciences, again in Germany, and the Polytechnic University of Valencia in Spain. And in 2015, he started with us at CU Boulder to earn his PhD, which he did in 2019. And he worked on spatial temporal information extraction under uncertainty using multi-source data integration machine learning methods. And his application case studies were around human settlement modeling. He is currently a postdoctoral research associate, as mentioned, with IBS and Earth Lab at the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences. And he's working in quite a few different projects. Many people at IBS and Earth Lab know him in the meantime as a methods expert on spatial temporal information extraction. He works a lot with building stock databases to better understand or derive new knowledge about the analysis of the built environment in the US, deriving new knowledge about how the urban development has taken place in the US and beyond, and working on fine-grained multi-temporal modeling in the rural-urban continuum of the US and North America in general. He has some experience from industry. He worked in industry for more than 3 years with a regional energy provider in Germany, very valuable knowledge that he brought with him for doing his PhD. Johannes is well published for a PhD in 2019. He has on his record 15 journal publications. Some highlights are lead authorships and co-authorships in Earth System Science Data, in Remote Sensing of Environment, in Science Advances, and Nature's Communication, Earth and Environment. He is one of the, if I may, co-founders of the HISDAC US, the Historical Settlement Data Compilation of the United States, a data product and sequence of data products that we have been working on for quite a few years. He's one really central part of this. And one of the big accomplishments of his career up to today. He won a Best Paper Prize from the International Association for Pattern Recognition in 2017 for his work on recognition and information extraction on historical maps. This is a talk that you will experience, which brings a lot of technical and methodological expertise, as I mentioned before. And one of the distinct contributions that Johannes has brought is to provide a new perspective on data exploration, on data assessment, on knowledge derivation for urban development, for better understanding the evolution of urban areas, settlement areas across the urban-rural continuum. With this, please welcome Johannes. Johannes, we are glad to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for zooming in. Thanks for the introduction, Eileen and Stefan. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen? So let's get started. So yeah, my talk is titled Leveraging Multi-Source Spatial Data to Characterize the Long-Term Evolution of Settlement and Population Distributions across the North American Rural-Urban Continuum. Brief outline. So I'll start with a very quick summary on the what I call the open data landscape, focused to what is relevant for my work that I'm presenting. And then I'll talk about some general research objectives, and then introduce, as Stefan already said, the historical settlement data compilation for the US, HISTAC US, which is a data product that we have created and published. And then I will talk about two analytical pieces that make use of these data to analyze the long-term settlement and urbanization patterns in the US. And after that, I'll talk about a different project which makes use of census data to model the long-term dynamics of the rural-urban continuum in North America. And then if time permits, I can also speak about some other data production efforts related to the built environment, but we'll see. So yeah, the open data landscape that is relevant here, I just try to summarize a little bit the types of data that I've been using. And as you know, there are increasing open data efforts by governmental, by research institutions, as well as by the industry. So more and more data is made publicly available to researchers and to anyone, basically. And this does not only increase the reproducibility of scientific work, but also enhances the opportunity for researchers in general. Some well-known tech companies have published some very useful data sets, as you can see here in the blue block. Then research institutions, there are some very useful global data sets on human settlements, as well as global accessibility and global population distributions. And then governmental institutions, just to mention a few countries in the Americas that have remarkably rich census data that is publicly available, and some other important data sets. Of course, this list is far from being complete in any way. But what I'm highlighting now are three data sets that I've used for the work that I'm going to be presenting, which is the Zillow transaction and assessment data set, ZTRAX, from the US real estate company Zillow. Then I'll make use of a global accessibility indicators data set from Nelson et al. And I'm working with census data from Canada, Mexico, and the US. So let's talk about some general research objectives. I've just tried to illustrate that there is such an increasing and incredibly heterogeneous availability of large multi-source data, that of course opens up new opportunities, but also poses new methodological challenges. So in order to extract the relevant information from these vast amounts of data, we need to develop effective and efficient data processing, data integration strategies. And this is where my work focuses from a methodological point of view. Also, I'd like to actively contribute to the open data infrastructure, for example, by the HISTEC US historical settlement data that I'll talk about in a bit. And I also like to demonstrate the knowledge that we can gain from such data and from these efforts by actually applying these data to answer some substantive research questions in the field of population dynamics or settlement dynamics and the built environment, urban geography. And ultimately, the thematic focus of my work is the built environment and the spatiotemporal dynamics of human settlements. So let's start with the historical settlement data compilation for the US, HISTEC US, which is, as I already said, a data set that we've created and published based on Zillow's ZTrax database. So Zillow has compiled ZTrax by collecting large amounts of data from county assessors and has harmonized them into a very large data model that holds around 300 million data records on property and building characteristics, as well as real estate transactions in the US, out of which around 150 million of these data records have a spatial geospatial reference. So what you can see on the left-hand side is a schematic visualization of that database and kind of an example how these data look like. So we have latitude, longitude, spatial reference, and then a range of thematic attributes for each property, such as the year built, land use type, and so on. So we've developed a data processing chain that allows us to import this large database into a analytical GIS environment, into geodatabases. And this is what you see now on the left-hand side. Basically, 150 million spatial or discrete locations that have attached a wide range of thematic attributes, such as the building indoor area for each building or the year when each building was built. So based on these data in the GIS environment, we've generated gridded data sets, gridded surfaces. For example, here we see the number of records within each grid cell. And what you see here is Boulder. Down here, like this blue stretch, is the road to El Dorado Canyon. Up here, Gun Barrel. So, and now I'll speak a little bit more in detail about these surfaces. So what you see here is one of the surfaces that we've published with the HISTEC US data. It's a conus-wide surface of the total building indoor area. So each grid cell holds, the building indoor area of all buildings within those grid cells. We call that built-up intensity. And you can see the red colors represent dense urban centers, probably with a lot of high-rise building. So this is a snapshot for 2016. And now this would be a corresponding surface that holds not the area of the buildings, but just the number of the buildings or records within each grid cell, which gives a slightly different but very similar picture. Now, the interesting thing is that we can actually make use of the year built attribute that is contained in ZTrax. So we can not only generate such a surface for 2016, which is the most recent point in time in the database, but also for 1970, 1930, even 1890. So we can nicely visualize how cities or the built environment has evolved over time. And it's the first time that we can look that far back based on a consistently enumerated data set. Besides that, we've also published a surface that holds the year of the first development. So the colors that you're seeing here encode the year when a grid cell became first built up. So blue are basically the historical centers of cities and towns, and then yellow and red areas, excuse me, are more recently built up areas. We can not only visualize this as a static map, but we can also animate the data and generate these kind of animations that integratively show the urban growth across the US. So what you see here are built up areas in white for each year from 1810 to 2015 for 35 cities in the US. The cities here are arranged in a quasi-geographic space. So Northeast, Boston will be the upper right, San Diego, Southwest will be the lower left, and then Seattle and Miami accordingly. So you can nicely see how cities have evolved at a very fine spatial detail. You can also observe like the general settlement patterns, which started obviously mostly in the Northeast. Santa Fe is one of the old southern cities, already pretty built up in the early 1900s, and Las Vegas, for example, developing relatively late. We can also look at changes, so not just visualizing the built up areas at a given point in time, but actually visualizing the areas that have changed from not built up to built up, or that have been developed within, we're showing here within 30-year time periods. So you can see like these kind of firework like structures that illustrate urban sprawl, urban growth. You can, for example, see, if you look at Indianapolis, which is a city that grows in a very concentric way. If you look at Detroit, you can nicely see how urban sprawl, or the city sprawled away from the shoreline. And if you look at San Francisco, you can see how urban development kind of moved around the bay towards the more mountainous regions of the Bay Area. So we can not only use these data to visualize long-term urbanization or settlement patterns, but we can also use these data to quantitatively assess settlement and urbanization. And that's what will talk about in the next section. So yeah, His.US data enables the spatially explicit quantitative analysis of urbanization over the long term. We created some metrics that allow us to characterize this development. One of them is the total building indoor area that we can basically calculate for any given spatial unit. What you see here are the long-term trends for the 4 census regions in the US, and they reflect pretty much the well-known settlement patterns with the west of the country developing later than most other parts of the country. If you look to the right, you see a metric that we call relative expansion. So it's the percentage increase of built up area with respect to the previous point in time. And this shows some interesting pattern. The Northeast in 1810 already quite developed as compared to the rest of the country, exhibits like a steadily declining relative expansion, whereas if you look at the other 3 census regions, you can see that the relative expansion peaks in very different points in time. We can not only characterize growth in general, we can also differentiate different types of growth. So we can look at expansion versus densification. So expansion as a measure of areal growth between 2 points in time. So it would be calculated just as the newly developed area or grid cells between 2 points in time, whereas densification is a measure that takes into account the increase in the number of buildings divided by the increase in developed area. So if you think that many new buildings are added in a very small area, we speak of a densification process, and this metric would yield a large value in that case. And what you can see here are the changes in area for, again, for the San Francisco region for 2 different time periods, change in buildings. So if we look at US-wide trends of expansion and densification, we can see some interesting patterns. We show here expansion and densification separately for urban counties versus rural counties. And you can see that in the green bars, which are rural counties, you don't see too much variation. You see pretty steady growth over time for both metrics. But if you look at the urban counties, you can see an interesting trend, especially in the more recent decades, starting in the 1970s, 1980s. You can see that expansion kind of reached a peak in the 2000s, and it seems like an average expansion is declining, whereas densification seems to go on kind of a exponential curve here. So we could now use these data in future research to make some projections in the future how the nature of urban growth will look like in a few decades, for example. Also interesting to look at are these maps in the bottom row, which show the peak year of expansion and densification. What is interesting here is that the peak year of expansion seems to follow rather an east-west pattern, whereas the year of the maximum densification rather follows a north-south pattern, as you can see here. So these are some very general and nationwide trends. We can also look at the trends of expansion and densification at the city level. What we see here are the areas that were newly developed in 2 different time periods, the first half roughly and the second half of the 20th century for San Francisco, Atlanta, and Boston. And you can see very different patterns here. So where you can see that, you know, the Bay Area experienced some heavy aerial growth in the first half of the 20th century. In the second half, you see the black areas, so the areas that change from not built up to built up, sparser, probably due to, you know, topographic constraints, whereas Atlanta is just sprawling extremely, and Boston as a already quite built up city in 1800 shows a less nuanced pattern here. But these patterns, they reflect in these time series that show very interesting diversity here. And we can go further. We can not only look at these trends at the individual city level, we can actually look at how cities in terms of their size interact over time. And I hope you can see that okay. It's a data animation. It's a so-called bar chart race that shows the built-up area for the, I think, 15 largest cities at a given point in time. And you can see how New York has for a long time been the largest city in terms of area. And now Atlanta actually passed New York just recently. If we look at this again, so the color coding here corresponds to the census region. So green is the Northeast. So as you can see in the beginning of the 20th century, Northeastern cities are among the largest. And now in the second half of the 20th century, the blue or violet cities are moving up, which are the cities of the South that are more recently but very fast developing, like Dallas Houston, and of course Atlanta. So this as another data visualization method. And this leads us to the second piece I'd like to discuss, which is a multivariate analysis of the urban spatial trajectories of cities, which we use here, the US metropolitan statistical areas, as a spatial container for what we call a city. And generally, we can describe cities by their size and by their density, right? But we can also describe cities by their shape, by their spatial structure, and by their morphology. So for simplicity, herein we call size and density just urban size, and call shape, structure, and morphology urban form. Now scholars have argued and have actually found evidence that urban size and urban form interacts with socioeconomic factors, with environmental and health aspects of a city, right? If you think of a city that has experiences high economic growth, there are jobs, so people will move there, so people will build there, so the city will expand, right? And on the other hand, you can think of a city that is very compact, that places are easy to reach, commutes are short, whereas cities that are, spatially more disconnected or dispersed, commuting might be more difficult, but access to open space, green space might be easier. So the spatial structure or spatial configuration of the city can have an effect on the quality of life, ultimately, of the inhabitants, right? Besides that relationship, there is also a relationship between urban size and urban form, and this is in the literature called urban scaling theory, or allometric relationships between size and form, or structural measures. And this work is kind of placed into this body of literature. We're basically asking two questions: how have size-related and form-related characteristics of cities changed over the long term? And have US cities followed similar or dissimilar trajectories with respect to these two groups of characteristics? So to give you an example here, this is how Atlanta looked like in 1910. So the dark spots are basically built up areas in 1910. We have the core. Atlanta is larger spot here in the center, and then a lot of small patches of built up land around it. And now if you look how it looks in 2010, it grew a lot. And this is an example where, for example, the number of built up patches has decreased over time, and one very large patch of built up area is dominant, right, in the contemporary picture. Now, if we look at Boulder County in the center, you see here Boulder, Longmont, this is Lafayette and Louisville in 1910. And if you look at this in 2010, you see there's a lot of growth, and you also see that there are new clusters that have emerged, like Gun Barrel, for example, that did not quite exist in 1910. So this would be an example where the number of built-up patches or contiguous patches of built-up land has increased over time. And as a third example, we can look at Ames, Iowa, in 1910 and in 2010. And you can see the number of clusters or the number of built-up patches stays relatively stable over time. So this would be a third group of, the development in terms of number of built-up patches. So according to this scheme, we basically calculated a range of metrics for each MSA for each point in time, in 5-year intervals from 1910 to 2010. which include 5 size-related metrics: the number of buildings within the MSA at a given year, the total building indoor area, the total developed area, built-up density, and also average housing unit size. And for the shape, structure, or form-related metrics, we calculated time series for each MSA for the number of contiguous patches of built-up land, the number of isolated or spatially disjoint small settlements as a measure of scatteredness, area proportions of the largest patch, measures of compactness and clusteredness. These are so-called landscape metrics in the literature. So we're able to generate time series for each MSA, for each city, for each of these variables. We applied dimensionality reduction techniques to these data and then conducted a trajectory analysis. We also conducted a cluster analysis, but I've put that in gray because I think I have to skip that for the sake of time, but I have some slides in the additional material. So if somebody's interested, we can discuss that later on. And then what we did, we basically compared these trajectories of cities with respect to their size development and their shape development or form development. So these are the trends of urban spatial metrics here across all cities. And to not overwhelm you, let's just focus on 2 size and 2 form related characteristics here. So as expected, the built up area increased a lot, but it's actually the first time that we're able to quantify that at such fine spatial detail over such a long time period. The vertical line here is the approximate start of the US suburbanization, right? So this is when most cities started to build out in the suburbs, and when people started to build their typically single-family homes into peri-urban areas. And the average housing unit size shows a very clear signal here. It actually has a drop in 1960 and then starts to increase. So that is really an effect of urban sprawl and suburbanization, where like suburban housing is considerably larger than the previously built inner urban residential housing. If we look at the lower left, we see the time series for 2 form-related variables, which is the number of isolated single settlements, scatteredness, and the number of patches. And you can see they first increase and then reach a peak in the 1980s or 1990s, and since then start to stagnate or even to decline again. And these are signals that are based on the increasing connectedness of previously disjoint parts of the city, right? So, it's also called a conurbation effect, that cities actually grow together and become more and more connected. So while these were the overall trends, we can also visualize the trajectories of each MSA individually. We use a dimensionality reduction called TSNE for that. That allows us to map these 5-dimensional time series for each city into a 2-dimensional space. We do this separately for our size and form related variables. And what you can see here, if you just compare the shape of these bundles of trajectories, you can see the size related trajectories. They seem to somehow converge. So cities become more and more similar with respect to their size, despite some megacities that are what we consider outliers. But if you look at the right-hand figure, you can see that cities seem to move into different directions with respect to their form-related trajectories. You can see Boston ends up in the upper right, 2010, whereas Kansas City, 2010, is located in the opposite corner of this two-dimensional attribute space. So this kind of indicates that there is a convergence with respect to size, but a divergence with respect to form of the city trajectories over the long term. And this indicates, alongside with other results that I won't have time to speak about, that there is an increasing disentanglement of size and form over time. And that's also one of the major findings of this article. You can see the reference at the bottom. Yeah, so these are the trajectories of MSAs. And now let's move away from these analyses that we've done based on our HISTEC US data and look at briefly discuss a project that models the long-term dynamics of the rural-urban continuum in North America. And this project is based on census data, not on our ZTRAX-derived HISTEC data. So yeah, modeling the rural-urban continuum and its dynamics. The motivation for this was actually came up in a project at IBS, the Tiny Towns project, which is led by Laurie Hunter, where we analyzed the changing demography of small town America. And to analyze tiny towns, you first need to define what are actually tiny towns. And there are existing rural-urban classifications. For example, what we can see here is the rural-urban continuum codes that the US Department of Agriculture creates and publishes that kind of give you an idea where more rural or predominantly urban areas are located. But if you want to analyze small towns, these classifications are spatially too coarse. They're at the county level. They're also temporally inconsistent. So what we overlay here are now the census places in the US. So you can see we need a rural-urban classification at a different spatial granularity. So this motivated us to develop a fine-grained, temporally consistent rural-urban classification model. So in this approach, we use what we call remoteness as a measure of rurality. What you see here, again, are US census places in 2018. But we do this for census places from 2018 back to 1930. Project members of the Tiny Towns project with Cyrus Hester, who is also a postdoc here at IBS, they have digitized place level population counts from the decennial census from 1930 to 1970. So we use these data. And the model is based on these very simplistic data, right? It's just the coordinates plus the population of each populated place. So this allows us to apply this model in data scarce environments, such as they can be found in other countries or in early time periods. So it's a very versatile method. So how does this method work? Based on these, populated places, we first generate a focal population density surface that you can see here. Go back and forth a little bit. So it's a focal population density surface that characterizes population density in the vicinity or proximity of each place. And then we're looking at the distances of each place to the nearest place of certain population ranges. So what you can see here is the surface that indicates for each place in the conus the distance to the nearest place of population 10,000 to 20,000. Note that we're looking here at Euclidean distances, so as the crow flies, we're not looking at road network distance because such data would not be available in early time periods. Similarly, distance surface to the nearest place of population 20,000 to 50,000. 50,000 to 100,000, 100,000 to 250,000, and to the nearest place of population greater than 250,000. So what do we do with these data? We design a remoteness index as a weighted average of the place population, the regional population density, and the distances to the nearest place of these population ranges that we've just seen. And we can assign different weights to each of these input variables, which allows us to, give different focus on population or on distance if we wanted to. And this yields a continuous measure of the rural-urban continuum at the place level. And we've created this not only for the US from 1930 to 2018, but also for Mexico using the great data sets at the locality level that contains populations for each of, I think, 300,000 localities from 1900 to 2010. And we also added Canadian census subdivisions that allows us to generate such an index surface for 1940, 1980, and 2010. And I'd like to briefly show you the results. So this would be such a place level remoteness as a measure of rurality for the US in 2018. You can see in red are the developed and highly urban areas. And for our tiny town project, we can now apply a certain threshold to this to identify small places in a very consistent manner. This is how the surface looks like for 1990, 1960, 1930. You can go back and forth a little bit. So it shows some very interesting patterns over time. Yeah, now we can also cross-compare this to such a county-level coarse rural-urban classification. So on the right, you see the result of our place-level remoteness index here in 2010 and the corresponding county-level classifications in 2013. So you can already observe, obviously, a much finer granularity in our data, but we can also quantify that or look at this in a more quantitative manner. So we can look at the place level distributions stratified by each county level rural urban class. This is what you see here. So you can see there's an increasing trend. So there's a positive association between the county level rural urban continuum code and our place level remoteness measure. But then what is interesting, we can actually map out where these outliers in these box plots are located. And in blue are the upper outliers. So it kind of indicates the place is more rural than the county designation indicates. And these places are mostly located in the western part of the country, with an exception of California. And the lower outliers, so places are more urban than the county designation indicates, are mostly located in the eastern part of the country. We further compared this measure to accessibility indicators. So as I mentioned previously, we use the Euclidean distance, so as the crow flies, to model these the remoteness. So we disregard the actual road network that people would have to travel to get from one city or town to another. But we use this Nelson et al. Accessibility indicators data set, which is a global data set that gives you the estimated travel time basically between any pairs of locations on Earth. And we reproduced this remoteness index based on travel time. And what you see in this scatter plot is the Euclidean distance-based remoteness index versus the travel time-based remoteness index. And what you can see is that by ignoring road network distance, we introduce quite a little bit of a bias into this index in urban areas. You can see here But if you move towards values greater than 0.5, you can see that the relationship between these two versions of that index becomes more and more linear. So this is quite encouraging because this is where we focus on, right? We want to select rural areas or rural places with that index. So this tells us that here at this end of the distribution, the effect is quite a linear bias that potentially can be even modeled. Yeah, so this would be a way to cross-compare or assess the plausibility of such a rural-urban continuum model. Now let's look at Mexico. So this would be a remoteness surface based on the localidades or localities population in 2010. So dark brown areas are the least remote ones, so the highly urban areas, as you can see here. Now if we go back in time, I can show this for 1960. Here you see quite some interesting changes, interesting dynamics. And in 1900, so note that these are relative surfaces, so they are not comparable through time, but they are only comparable within each time period, within each temporal cross-section. So in 1900, the least remote places were basically all focused here in the center of the country, whereas in 2010, we see a very different picture here. Yeah, lastly, we can look at the North American remoteness results, which are based on a harmonized version of the populated places, which is based on US Census places, again, the Mexico localidades dataset, and then census subdivisions from the Canadian census. In total, approximately 490,000 data points for these 3 years. And we can see the input data points here in 2010. This would be 1980. This would be 1940. What you can observe is a difference in granularity between Mexican and the US place-based data, right? You can see a very stark contrast here. But if you look at the resulting index surface, you can see that the transition across the US-Mexican border is very smooth. So this method is insensitive to differences in the granularity of the input data. So this would be a integrated remoteness surface for Northern America in 2010. So this would be 1980, and this is how it looked like in 1940. Yeah, so I think with this, I'm at the end of the presentation, a few concluding remarks. So we've seen that open data sources in general provide vast opportunities for social, environmental, and geographic sciences. We've also seen that such novel data and innovative data processing strategies drastically increase the spatial, but also the semantic granularity and the observation extent at which we can measure or analyze geographic processes across space and time, and how such data enables novel insight and unprecedented detail. Future work will include the further cross-comparison of these data sources. For example, we could ask, how do long-term trajectories of the built environment relate to remoteness and to other socioeconomic environmental characteristics? And we will also expand on the evaluation and plausibility analysis of the created or continuum models. So a few references, and then here are a few online resources, the data repository for the HISTAC US data, and then all the animations that I've shown are also available online on our YouTube channel and Flourish. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Johannes. What a great presentation. You can see and feel this is a lot of work that Johannes so nicely summarized over the last few years. Not everything, there's so much more that we could talk about. He mentioned this from time to time, but I think this is a very nice summary of some of the most relevant aspects that really fit nicely together on urban development, on rural urban continuum research. So thank you very much, Johannes. And we have a few minutes open the floor for questions. Yeah, okay. I can see there are some entries coming into the chat, but if somebody wants to ask a question right away per audio, please go ahead.
I could ask a question.
Lori,
This is Stefan. It's for you as well as Johannes. But I'm really curious if you have examples of what people have done with that great HISTAC data. Do you know some instances where people have been able to use that to do some cool work? I bet you do.
Yeah, so I know of one paper where they used the data to study the evolution of historical road networks, basically by using these historical settlement extents to overlay them with contemporary road network data, and then analyze how the road network layout has changed over time. This is one example, and then people have used it in the context of wildfires and natural hazards. But it's in the beginning, right? So there are not too many publications out, but I know that people are using it, and I'm sure we will see more papers published in the near future.
It's very exciting. I think there's just potential for so many different kinds of questions. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I know that some people are starting to use the data for topics such as urban tree cover, and Johannes mentioned natural hazards. I know that EarthLab folks are using the data more and more for multi-hazard assessments, for fire risk models and fire risk assessments. So yeah, our hope is that it really will pick up at some point, that people realize and know about the data and start using them a little bit more frequently. Any other questions?
Jason had his hands up.
Jason, please.
So this is, I'll be sending you guys a note really soon. This is really, really, really exciting. I don't know if you know, but Lori and Trent and I were recently looking at genetic associations as a function of rural, urban, suburban location, trying to figure out whether the environment might moderate this. And we're really interested in the selection of who's moving into and out of rural communities, and if it's random or it's not. And that was the foundation for my question, which is, you do an incredible job detailing place and changes in place. How much of this is the composition of individuals who are selecting into and out of places that are driving these, or is the selection of individuals into certain places driven by some of the indicators you have of places? I mean, I'm trying, is it people or is it places? And I know that it's not either or, but how much of this has to do with the uniqueness of who? And let's be honest, Vegas is the perfect example. If we just do a linear line, we're not going to get it. It's completely shoots up. Those who are selecting into Vegas and all the building up, is that a random selection of the US population, or is it a completely select group? And so my question is, how much do you pull out the true composition of who's selecting into it?
Well, these are great thoughts. I mean, I haven't really looked at that. Maybe Stefan has an idea, or somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, Jason. Yeah, go ahead, Johannes, if you have more thoughts on that.
No, that's obviously a great way how this data could be applied and combined with census or migration data, right?
Yeah. And Jason, that's part of our future agenda to some degree, to shed some light on some of these really important questions. How does the built environment or developed places actually interact with population? We don't know. Not too much about it, right? How they actually interrelate, what kind of predictors do we have to better understand population distributions and their changes in relation to the built environment under different scenarios, under different environmental conditions, under environmental constraints, etc. So these are really important questions that are to some part on our agenda, hopefully.
There were a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them, or you want to?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so Scott Ortman asked, have you linked HISTEC US to other non-built environment types of data? I was thinking about housing values, for example. Seems to me like there's a lot of potential for thinking about how the built environment and its development affects aggregate living standards, distributions, etc.
Well, so the ZTrax database itself contains housing values, right? So I actually have a slide on that in the supplementary material. So that's we've already created such surfaces. Can you see that? Like this? Sorry. Yeah, this is building quality attribute from ZTrax. So we've generated surfaces of such variables as well. This would be the average assessed value for each property derived from ZTrax. So that information is in there, and we are working on that. But obviously, it could only also be combined with such information from the census or from other data sources.
Thank you. Morteza asked, how does the census's rural-urban designation for CBG hold up? It's only tangential relevant to the talk, but still an interesting question that relates to the applications, right, of these data.
What is CPG?
Thanks for reading, Fernando. This is Morteza. Great work, Johannes. Census block group, and I might be actually wrong in the sense that I know since the census has some sort of designation for rural urban, and I don't quite remember if it's a top-down approach in which a population density of a chunk is taken, and then the designations are assigned to the census block groups, or a bottom-up. So I'm sure people in the room know way better than I do. But I was just wondering, between your work, HISTEC, and the census block group, how does this rural-urban continuum hold up, the one that the census tells us that this is a rural chunk or this is an urban chunk?
Well, so as far as I know, that the census designations are binary, urban or rural. So we haven't really looked at how this relates to our continuous measure.
Yeah, I figured because again, I might be wrong. I figured because the designations are at a fine geographic, census block group, let's say, level. Again, I might be wrong. I figured maybe the aggregates of those at the county can be compared, or at the census tract level can be compared against your work. And again, it was only tangentially relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Morteza. These are important questions, just to emphasize, because that's part of what we're looking into. For example, the Tiny Town project, more emphasizing the rural areas, the rural settings of the country, but also understanding the continuum between rural and urban settings. So that's a really important research agenda going forward. We are at the top of the hour. Please, everyone, feel invited to send more questions to Eileen, and she will send those to us if somebody has more questions. We are more than happy to answer those. And I'm more than happy to get into any exchanges, any bouncing back and forth ideas that people have in using these HISTEC data or other approaches. Let me thank Johannes for his great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this, Johannes. I think everybody has a really deep insight into your research, into your interest. And I'm really glad we had this opportunity to show this to COPC and IBS folks and other visitors. So thank you everyone for attending. Eileen, do you have a final word?
No, thank you very much, Stefan, for closing it out for us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Johannes.
having me.
Thanks, Johannes.